here to present this morning. The preliminary work that we are doing at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. So the team consists of Dr. Nadine Sangster, Dr. Atma Maraj, and with this part of the study, we collaborated with Dr. Alan Sami, who is the current chairman of the Penal Debe Regional Corporation. So this presentation will basically introduce the Penal Debe area and the impact that flooding has had on the region over the last 3 years. So the area, of course, is heavily populated. So the last figure that we had is 90,000 persons residing within the 250 square kilometer area. And the sub-areas within Penal Debe are listed there. So some of the more heavily affected areas would be Barrackpore, both Barrackpore East and West. Then we'd have Penal, Woodland, and Debe. So let's look at what the objectives really were of this initial study. So we try to understand how the flooding that has taken place within the area has affected residents primarily. And we try to get some basic or preliminary information on the dollar figure that translates to, and did some analysis of the current infrastructure that exists. And some recommendations would have been made as to how we should probably go forward in developing solutions. So first of all, we looked at the area to identify the scale of the problem. We conducted surveys with residents to really understand the human impact of this flooding and what the residents really had to go through. We looked at some of the current infrastructure in the region, and we proposed some solutions for alleviation. Right? So I like to put this work into perspective though, in that this was just the initial phase, and we are currently progressing with further development of models of flooding in the area and the implementation of instrumentation and whatnot to try and guide understanding of the flooding that has taken place. So looking at the area itself, we can see that the Penal Debe area, or the entire region really, the majority of it, or a large portion of it, is under 4 feet above sea level. So it's actually located within the South Oropouche watershed, right? And it's an area that is generally very highly susceptible to flooding. So it's no surprise, therefore, that with prolonged or heavy rainfall, you do have flooding taking place. But over the last 3 years in particular, the flooding has gotten to the point where residents have become adversely affected such that they have been stranded, they are unable to exit their homes in some cases, and there has been mass loss of items in their household and damage to their property. So some of the other factors that have contributed to this increase in flooding are unplanned or illegal development. So just in the last week, actually, you may have seen in the news 2 developments that are taking place on riverbanks or encroaching into rivers. And there is contention with the Ministry of Works and the corporation as to the legality of these things. And what tends to take place is that the developer often goes ahead and fills the river up or encroaches onto watercourses, knowing that there would be little legal repercussions, or by the time it takes place, it would have already done the works and it would be of no consequence to them. We also have a lot of squatting in the area. So just in the woodland area alone, there was estimated to be approximately 50,000 persons, right? Woodland, South Oropouche, and Faizabad, squatting in various parts. So these would be unplanned developments and general drainage. So little things like roadside drains may not have been developed to help with the additional water runoff that would come from roofs or paved areas from these houses. So to look at the incidents of flooding that would have taken place. So this chart, while it might not be too clear, has been derived from the newspaper reports and articles that would have existed every time there was an incident of flooding within the area. So you can see that the first serious or extreme case of flooding occurred in 2017, and it kind of coincided with Tropical Storm Bret. And after that, later on in that year, there was another smaller case of flooding. So initially, this was played off as due to the tropical storm being, well, providing a lot of rainfall for a short period of time, and that caused the water table to become saturated. But then the subsequent year, there was also flooding, right? This was in, well, November 2018. There was another case of extreme flooding. And then last year again. So it seems that this is now an annual problem, and that residents throughout the region are taking steps now to try and mitigate against losses on their properties, because they have come to expect it almost. So in looking at the human impact, we conducted a survey with 332 residents, and we gauged a few points. So the first thing that we looked at was their perception of the severity of the flooding. So we can see that the majority of people that we interviewed either gauged the flooding as very severe or critically severe. So these would be in terms of criteria such as damage to property, isolation, being unable to exit their homes, things like that. So it would be along that scale that they had gauged the impact to themselves. In terms of a dollar figure, a large portion of the respondents identified losses between $30,000 and $50,000. And we even had a few gauging more than $200,000 in losses. So the types of losses were to crops, livestock, household appliances, infrastructural damage to properties, losses to vehicles, all of these types of things. And here's a breakdown in terms of the type of items lost, right? And we also asked the residents what they perceive to be the predominant causes of this type of flooding. So a lot of them identified from their observation poor drainage, lack of maintenance of the watercourses that would be existing already, lack of infrastructure. So this would be things like drainage, well, drains, concrete structures to deal with the flooding, floodgates, all of these types of things. And of course, illegal building. So having understood what damage is being done to the residents in the area and the impact that it had, we took it upon ourselves to do a survey of the area itself, the region, and look at what state the infrastructure was in. So when we looked at the drainage, in terms of the roadside drains, a lot of them were severely undersized. They were over 50 years old and in some cases less than 6 inches deep. So the picture on the right is a typical example of a roadside watercourse. So you may not even notice that there is a drain there because it's covered in weeds, and it has not been cleared for a very long period of time. There are cases where the corporation or the Ministry of Works would have done concrete drains or box drains as they're called locally, but they are not consistent in their implementation. So what takes place is that you have bottlenecking points as well. Also, where there are drains, maintenance is not always regular or standardized. So you'll have dirt and weeds developed within the drain as well. So some of the areas that we identified for maintenance, as you can see on the list there, it's really prevalent. So we have a lot of roads and traces that are highly occupied by residents, and they are major thoroughfares. So when these roads become affected, we'll have a lot of isolation taking place, or a lot of inconvenience to the traveling public. Looking at the rivers themselves, so the rivers.
Can you run down,
Yeah,
please?
Nelly. The rivers themselves are the major watercourses, and some of the recommendations that we had there were looking at channelization, which was dredging and widening and deepening of the river, development of meanders. So these meanders would help to slow the water flow through the river to try and prevent that rapid rise in water flow. Retaining walls in certain portions of the river would assist in maintaining the river banks, and it would help in directing the floodwaters. Gabions and Reno matrices are preferred because they would allow the banks to be stabilized without having concretization taking place and have vegetation coming in as well. There has always been a call for retention ponds and dams in the area to help with water scarcity and also to store this to create capacitance to store this large volume of water. And of course, vegetation of the wetlands. Climate change has always been a problem in the area, and education of residents in terms of the impact of illegal development and littering would play a part as well. Flooding hardware, so there are very few active floodgates in the area. Although there are 9, only 2 of them are working, and there has also been identified the potential of a parallel river delta to help with runoff when there are cases of high rainfall. So in conclusion, we looked at the major causes of flooding in the region and the impact that it would have had on the people in the area, and presented some preliminary findings I made some recommendations to alleviate the flooding. So that's the end of the presentation. Here are some references, and I'll invite any questions